Have you seen God this morning? Because I believe that we can find God anywhere we look. God is here with us. And as I often say, under every blade of grass, you can find God. But do we really, truly see God? And when we have seen God, what does that mean to us? Does our life change when we've really seen God? You know, several years ago, Rhoda and I were on one of our trips to Hawaii. And we were walking down the street, and we heard a man who was talking at a very loud level of his voice. And he was standing on a little wooden Coca-Cola case. And he was under a marvelous banyan tree, a giant tree. And he was talking at the top of his voice. And he had a Bible in one hand, and he would raise it around as he talked. And he was really giving it the good old fundamentalist talk. And he was really good at it. And he was telling us all who would listen that the end is near. And you better be ready to meet your Maker. Well, like about everybody else, we walked on by. He didn't have a crowd in front of him. He was talking to a lot of people walking by, but a lot of vacant space. And we both wondered, what if that was really Jesus? Would that get our attention? How would we know? Would we really know if that was Jesus? Would we really recognize, yes, this is Jesus? Golly, I wonder. I want to ask you a question about a couple of men I have known in this life. And I want to know, you don't have to raise your hand, I'm just asking a rhetorical question, if you have ever been lucky enough, as I was, to know Frank Johnson and Tommy Wright. Frank came to the church one day, and he asked the secretary if he could visit with the pastor. And the secretary came into my office, and that's when we were over at 10th and Nyssa, and she whispered to me, "There's a bum outside here in the office. And I don't know, he is very dirty, and he's very scary. But he wanted to see you." And she asked me, "How do I get rid of him?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you how. You get rid of him by bringing him into my office." She was right. When he came in the office, he certainly wasn't somebody you run down the street because you wanted a chance to meet him. He probably hadn't had a bath, golly, I don't know how long. More than many weeks, maybe more than many months. And you didn't have to see him to know that, if you know what I mean. Dirt and dust fell off of his clothes as he walked into the office, kind of like the cartoon with Peanuts with the dust cloud hanging over his head. That dust cloud was in him and on him, and it just floated around him. He was so dirty. And he had long gray/white hair reaching down to wherever, and it was scraggly and wild. And that hair hadn't seen soap, water, comb, or a brush in God knows how long. And he had a large, wild, unkempt beard that went in all directions. And it seemed like he'd been rolling around in the dust with his beard, because as he talked with his toothless mouth, dust seemed to float out of his beard. He was really something else. That was Frank Johnson. His fingernails were long, and they were jagged-edged, and they were so dirty that you could plant a vegetable garden under each one of them, or at least it looked like a grease spill could be under the fingernails. Well, you get the picture. Wasn't a real nice guy to look at and to see. And when he came in the office, I invited him to sit down, and that surprised him, and he jolted back. But then he finally did sit down in the chair, and he proceeded to tell me I live just a few blocks away from the church here, and I'm in my 70s, and don't work, can't work, don't have any way to make any money. I take care of my mother, and he listed some of her illnesses. I think one of them, as I recall, she was on dialysis. Probably looked a lot like Frank. I thought he was going to ask for a handout, but he didn't. He surprised me. He didn't ask for anything. He sat there a minute in silence, and then he said, I wonder if you would do something for me. I just have one favor I'd like to ask. And I said, what's that? And he said, I and my mother both need prayer. Pastor, would you say a prayer for us? So as I always do, I reached out my hand to take his hands in mine. And he recoiled. And he said, are you going to touch me? And I said, of course. And he broke down and he cried like a baby. He said, no human being has touched me other than my mother in so many years. And he said, when I walk down the street, people get onto the other side of the street so that they don't have to be next to me. And he cried and he cried. And we prayed. And then he left. He came back one more time for another prayer. I never saw Frank again. Don't know what happened to him. Could that have been Jesus? Could it? Golly, I don't know. Have you and I seen some time in our life and not even really known it? You know, many people in the recounting of the Bible saw Jesus and nothing special happened, while others were wowed by his miracles. But then once Jesus started talking about God, and God being the source of all of his miracles, God the Father, and what God wanted from us, people stopped listening. And then they start arguing. They would argue even in those days about whose God is the real God. And we do that today. Some of us here today will argue with people of other faith traditions about whose God is the real God, rather than just worshiping the God that we love. Would we remember the words Jesus told us when he said to love one another? I wonder, that can be an expensive price to pay, to love one another. You see, the people who were around Jesus at that time didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear about God in the flesh. They only wanted to hear about God being the Messiah. Somebody who would come and resolve all of their problems and save them, and come and stop the wars, and then take them into eternal life. They didn't want to hear about what would happen if they truly followed God and followed Jesus. They didn't want to learn about what it means to be in the eternal kingdom here and now. They didn't want to know Him. They didn't want to recognize Him. Do we? Do you? Do I? I had a Lutheran pastor at one time who really impressed me with this comment about following Jesus. He said, if you're going to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. You better be willing to pay the price. You better be willing to make some sacrifices. You see, Jesus changes our ideas about God, even as He does for the disciples. Because after the disciples had seen Jesus, after they had heard Jesus, after they had seen Him die and seen Him rise again from the dead, they could never think about God in the same way. It wasn't the same God that they had learned about now that they had a human face to give God. You see, by changing how we see God, Jesus changes our very relationship with God. Up until they met Him, they were doing what you and I do on Sunday. They were worshiping God. But now it becomes a matter of serving God. Are we sure? Are we really sure that we want to see Him and know Him? Are we willing to look good on wood? To see Him and to know Him brings a change in our relationship with God. Our relationship becomes one of serving rather than being served. We attend church on Sunday not because it's the thing to do. Gee, I remember a time when I used to attend church just in case there's something to this stuff. Or we don't serve on committees just because it's expected of us. But now it's because our relationship with God has truly changed. We do these things because we have seen Jesus. We know God. We do these things because it becomes natural to us. It becomes a part of our way of life. That's who we are. We are people who love God. We want to be with God, and we want to be with people who love God. And I need to tell you, from a personal experience, and maybe others have experienced it, if you haven't, I pray that you will get to, there is a real joy in having a relationship with God. We were made for that. We were made to know God and to be filled with God's glory. And I was not, as I've told you many times, the kind of a person who would always have held Frank Johnson's hand. Not me. I never would have. At that time, I would have never prayed for him. and I would never have truly cared about him. No, that was the work of God in my life, because I at one point had had a metamorphosis. I had seen God, and I wanted to do those things because I wanted to love God and serve God. So I want to tell you another true story. It was about one of the best friends I ever had in my life. And I loved the guy. He was a guy who was arrested more times, and probably even to this date, he's been dead a few years, than any other individual in the history of McAllen, Texas. His name was Tommy Wright. Tommy was a street person, and he was a street person by choice. He'd done a lot of things in his other life. He'd actually even been a soccer player in Mexico, but he, for his own reason that I won't go into, chose to be a street person. And when I met him, he'd lived on the streets of McAllen for over 30 years. Tommy was a hopeless alcoholic. He'd been arrested for loitering and public drunkenness literally hundreds of times over the years. And some of the members of our congregation used to get very irritated because he'd come and fall asleep on our doorway entrance and leave his whiskey bottles laying around. And once I came here and he became kind of protected him a little bit, I caught a little bit of flack for having Tommy around. And I had people, well, we're going to call the police. I said, well, that wouldn't be anything new in his life. Tommy rather, was somebody who would give Frank Johnson a good run for his money about who was the dirtiest and the most unkept and the least likely person that you would ever want to be close to. Oddly enough, I would hug Tommy every time he came in. And I would check myself to see if the dust was all over me. Tommy was a hopeless alcoholic, unkempt, but he was a kind-hearted soul, if you knew Tommy. He believed in God. He was very intelligent. He was very knowledgeable about current events. He kept up on what was current because he'd pick up newspapers on the street that had been thrown away, and he'd read them. And he'd see little bits of television through store windows. So he knew what was going on. I always used to tell him he didn't understand what was going on because he and I had some heated political arguments. He believed in the wrong candidate, and of course I believed in the right candidate. And we had many theological discussions. He was quite knowledgeable about theology. I was amazed at the depth of his faith and the depth of his understanding of religion. Tommy was a Catholic. As I said, he was an alcoholic. Tommy was a gay man. And he did not feel well received by his faith, because his faith told him that being gay was unforgivable. He didn't feel comfortable in AA because of who he was, what he was, and because of his faith beliefs and being gay. And he also had another problem. He was very suicidal. And he would express this to the priest. And they would tell him, no, 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 that's an unforgivable sin. You will go directly to hell. And he was afraid of going to hell. And that troubled him. And we talked about that many times. So Tommy stayed drunk most of the time. Shortly before his death, He tried treatment again. I got him in a treatment center up in Iowa. The ones down here had had him so many times they didn't want to take him anymore. And so the Salvation Army agreed to take him if I could get him to Iowa. And we paid his bus fare to Iowa. And the Salvation Army was supposed to meet him at the bus, because I told them, if you don't, Tommy's going to get off and get drunk. Well, they didn't meet him. They missed him. Sure enough, Tommy got off the bus and he got drunk. But a few days later, they found him out on the railroad tracks. They took him to treatment. Tommy got sober in treatment. He worked his way back to Corpus Christi, Texas. He went to AA. He had about 6 months of sobriety. Wonderful months. He started a little business. He would come to your house or to the store, wash your car, and wash windows. And I even helped him make up business cards. And he was doing real well. Then his gay lover died. And Tommy was not allowed to go to the funeral. And he was reminded of how sinful it was to be gay by his church and by other friends. And Tommy couldn't stand the loss of his significant other for many years. So he came by the office one day, and I wasn't there. And he told the secretary, "Tell Max that I love him. Tell him not to be too mad at me." That night, Tommy went on a highway out in Edinburgh, dark, rainy night, stepped in front of a high-speeding car to kill himself. And when the police brought a picture of Tommy to me to identify and showed him, I wept. I wept over Tommy. There was a time when I could have made all kinds of castigations about Tommy, like many others. And I hear it, friends, almost on a daily basis from people who are good Christian, good church people, about how these people, that's not what Jesus wants you and I to do. He wants us to love one another, not to hate one another, not to denigrate one another because they're different. Doesn't mean, I had an old Baptist preacher one time, I had a son who had all kinds of problems, and he says, "Max, we can love the sinner without loving the sin." And when we get to that point, my friends, when we can do that, we have seen Jesus. But until that time that we can truly love one another without being so hypercritical of them, trying to put them down so we feel better, then we have seen Jesus. And I pray, and I hope, if you haven't been lucky enough in your life to meet Frank Johnson and Tommy Wright, you do that. It's truly a gift from God. Amen.